The smell of lye soap and damp would filled Margot's nostrils as her knuckles scraped against the rough floorboards of the Grand Northern Hotel in Hill City, South Dakota, and she wondered if her hands would ever feel soft again. It was 1878, and the town was thriving with gold prospectors, cattle ranchers, and men seeking fortune in the Black Hills. But Margot Lawson had found only hardship since arriving 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart still mending from loss. The water in her bucket had turned brown with the dirt tracked in by countless boots, and she sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of dark hair from her face with the back of her wrist. At 23 years old, she had expected more from life than scrubbing floors in a hotel where she also slept in a cramped storage room behind the kitchen. Her parents had died of fever back in Illinois, leaving her with no siblings and no prospects, so she had taken what little money remained and bought passage west, hoping for a fresh start. "You missed a spot near the stairs, Mrs. Henderson called out from behind the front desk, her sharp voice cutting through the quiet morning. The hotel owner was a stern woman with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. "And when you are done with that, the windows need cleaning. We have important guests arriving this afternoon." Margot nodded without looking up, dipping her brush back into the murky water. Her back ached from bending over, and her knees were sore from kneeling on the hard floor, but she had learned not to complain. Complaints got you nowhere except out on the street, and she had nowhere else to go. The front door opened with a gust of cool morning air, and Margot glanced up briefly to see a tall man step inside. He wore dusty traveling clothes, a dark hat pulled low over his eyes, and well-worn boots that spoke of long miles on horseback. A gun belt hung at his hip, and he carried himself with the confident ease of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I need a room for the week," the man said, his voice deep and steady as he approached the front desk. "Something clean and quiet." "That will be $7, Mrs. Henderson replied, her tone considerably warmer than when she spoke to Margot. "Payable in advance." The man counted out the money without hesitation, and Margot found herself watching him from the corner of her eye as she continued scrubbing. There was something different about him, though she could not quite place what it was. He did not have the rough, aggressive manner of the prospectors who usually stayed at the hotel, nor the loud bravado of the cowboys who came through town driving cattle. "Room 6, up the stairs and to the left," Mrs. Henderson said, handing him a key. "Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6. We do not tolerate any trouble here." "I am not here to cause trouble," the man assured her. He picked up his saddlebag and turned toward the stairs, and for just a moment his eyes met Margot's. They were a striking blue-gray, like storm clouds over the prairie, and they held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he nodded slightly and continued on his way. Margot felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly looked back down at the floor, her brush moving in vigorous circles. She could not afford to be caught staring at guests. Mrs. Henderson had strict rules about fraternizing, and Margot needed this job too desperately to risk losing it over a momentary distraction. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of work. After finishing the lobby floor, Margot moved on to the windows, then helped in the kitchen preparing vegetables for the evening meal, then carried linens up and down the stairs until her arms trembled with exhaustion. It was well past noon when she finally had a moment to sit down with a piece of bread and some cheese in the kitchen. "That new guest in room 6 asked about you," said Clara, one of the other girls who worked at the hotel. She was younger than Margot, barely 18, with red hair and a face full of freckles. "Asked Mrs. Henderson who you were." Margot nearly choked on her bread. "What did she tell him?" "That you were hired help and none of his concern," Clara said with a giggle, but he seemed mighty interested. He is handsome, is he not? I saw him when he came downstairs for lunch. I did not notice, Margot lied, taking another bite of her bread to avoid further conversation. The last thing she needed was to develop foolish notions about a guest who would be gone within a week. She had made that mistake once before, back in Illinois with a smooth-talking merchant who had promised her the world and delivered nothing but heartbreak. The afternoon brought more work, and Margot pushed thoughts of the mysterious guest from her mind. She had chamber pots to empty, beds to make, and carpets to beat, and daydreaming would not get any of it done. By the time evening fell and the dinner service began, she was too tired to think about much of anything except getting through the rest of her shift. The dining room filled with the usual assortment of guests, prospectors comparing claims, businessmen discussing investments, and a few families passing through on their way to somewhere else. Margot helped carry plates from the kitchen, keeping her eyes down and her steps quick. Mrs. Henderson believed that good help should be invisible, and Margot had learned to move through the room like a shadow. She was carrying a tray of dirty dishes back to the kitchen when someone spoke her name. Miss Lawson. She turned to find the man from room 6 standing near the dining room entrance. Up close, she could see that he was probably in his late 20s, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face was lean and angular, with a strong jaw and those unusual gray-blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Yes, sir," she replied, mindful of the heavy tray in her hands. "I am Callum Xander," he said, removing his hat politely. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I am a rancher from over near Rapid City, and I am in town on business." Margot was not sure how to respond to this. Guests did not typically introduce themselves to the hired help, and she could feel Mrs. Henderson's sharp gaze on her from across the room. "That is nice, sir," she managed. "If you will excuse me, I need to get these dishes to the kitchen." "Of course," he said, but he did not move aside immediately. "I also wanted to say that I noticed you working earlier. You do a thorough job. This hotel is fortunate to have someone so dedicated." The compliment caught her off guard, and she felt that heat rising to her cheeks again. "Thank you, sir. That is kind of you to say." "Callum," he corrected gently. "My name is Callum." Before she could reply, Mrs. Henderson appeared at her elbow like a hawk swooping on prey. "Miss Lawson has work to attend to, Mr. Xander. I am sure you understand." "Of course," Callum said smoothly, stepping aside. But as Margot hurried past him toward the kitchen, she felt his eyes following her, and something fluttered in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the windows. Margot was up before sunrise, as always, starting the fires and helping prepare breakfast. Her small room behind the kitchen was barely big enough for a narrow cot and a washstand, but at least it was warm and dry, which was more than many people in Hill City could say. As she was setting out plates in the dining room, Callum came down the stairs. He was dressed more formally today, in a dark suit that suggested he had important business to attend to, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Good morning, Miss Lawson," he said warmly. "Good morning, sir," she replied, focusing on arranging the silverware properly. "I was hoping I might speak with you after breakfast," he said, lowering his voice so the other early risers in the dining room would not hear. "Perhaps when you have a moment free." Margot's hand stilled on the fork she was placing. "I am not sure that would be appropriate, sir." "It is about a business matter," he assured her. "Something that might be of interest to you. I promise it will only take a few minutes of your time." She glanced toward the kitchen, where she could hear Mrs. Henderson giving orders to the cook. Every instinct told her to refuse, to keep her head down and avoid complications. But there was something in Callum's eyes, an earnestness that made her pause. "I have a short break after breakfast service," she said quietly. "I could meet you in the lobby for a moment." "Thank you," he said, and the smile that crossed his face transformed it entirely, making him look younger and more approachable. "I appreciate it." The breakfast service seemed to drag on forever. Margot poured coffee, carried plates, and cleared tables, all while wondering what Callum could possibly want to discuss with her. Business matter, he had said, but what business could a rancher have with a hotel maid? When the last guest had finished eating and she had a few precious minutes before starting the morning cleaning, she found Callum waiting in the lobby, standing near the window and looking out at the street. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "I know your time is valuable." "What is this about, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Mrs. Henderson was in the office behind the front desk, and walls had ears in this hotel. Callum gestured toward 2 chairs near the cold fireplace, away from the desk. "May we sit?" Margot hesitated, then nodded. She perched on the edge of one chair, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, very aware of her plain work dress and the strand of hair that had escaped her bun. Callum sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I am going to be direct with you, Miss Lawson, because I think you are someone who values honesty." "I do," she confirmed, her heart beating faster. "I own a ranch about 20 miles from here," he began. "It is a good-sized spread with cattle and horses, and it has been doing well. But I lost my housekeeper last month when she decided to move back east to be with her daughter, and I have been managing on my own since then. It is not working." Margot listened, not sure where this was going. "I need someone to run the household," Callum continued. "Someone organized and hardworking who can manage the cooking, cleaning, and general running of the house. I also need help with the ranch books, as my previous housekeeper used to assist with that. I watched you yesterday and this morning, and I can see you are competent and thorough. I would like to offer you the position." She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to hire me as your housekeeper?" "Yes," he said simply. "The pay would be $30 a month plus room and board in your own cottage on the property. You would have Sundays off and freedom to come into town whenever you needed. It is hard work, but I think it would be better than what you have here. $30 a month." Margot made $12 a month at the hotel, and that was without a private room. It was a fortune in comparison, and the idea of having her own cottage, her own space, made her head spin. "Why me?" she asked, trying to make sense of it. "You do not know me. I could be unreliable or dishonest." "I am a good judge of character," Callum said. "I have had to be in my line of work. I can see that you are someone who takes pride in what you do, even when the work is hard and thankless. That is the kind of person I need at my ranch." "And that is all this is?" Margot asked carefully. "You need a housekeeper, nothing more." His eyes met hers steadily. "That is all this is?" "I am a businessman making a business offer. You would have your own cottage, your own privacy, and my respect. I am not the kind of man who takes advantage of people who work for me." Something in his tone convinced her he was telling the truth. She had become good at reading people in the past 6 months, learning to distinguish between those who meant what they said and those who did not. "I would need to give Mrs. Henderson notice," she said slowly, part of her unable to believe she was actually considering this. "Give her 2 weeks, Callum suggested. "That should be fair. I can wait that long. In the meantime, if you want to come out and see the ranch first to make sure it suits you, I can arrange that." "I think I would like that," Margot admitted. The idea of leaving the hotel, of having something better, was almost too good to believe, but she had learned to be cautious. "When could I see it?" I have business in town tomorrow, Callum said, but the day after that I could take you out there. It is about an hour's ride by wagon. We could leave in the morning and have you back by evening, so there would be nothing improper about it. Margot nodded slowly. All right, I would like to see it before I make my decision. That is fair, Callum said, standing as she did. Thank you for considering it, Miss Lawson. I think you might find it a good fit. As she watched him walk back up the stairs to his room, Margot felt something shift inside her. For the first time since arriving in Hill City, she felt a spark of hope that life might offer something more than endless floors to scrub and chamber pots to empty. The next 2 days passed in a haze of anticipation and doubt. Margot went about her usual duties, but her mind kept wandering to Callum's offer. Clara noticed her distraction and pestered her for details, but Margot kept quiet. She had learned the hard way that other people's jealousy could ruin opportunities, and she was not going to risk this one by talking about it too soon. On the morning of the 3rd day, she woke earlier than usual and dressed in her best dress, which was still plain and worn but at least clean and neatly mended. She had told Mrs. Henderson she needed the morning off for personal business, and the older woman had granted it grudgingly, reminding her that the time would be deducted from her pay. Callum was waiting in the lobby with a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He looked more relaxed than he had in his business suit, wearing practical ranch clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes from the early morning sun. "Good morning," he greeted her, helping her up onto the wagon seat. "It is a beautiful day for a drive," and it was. The October sky was brilliant blue, and the air had that crisp quality that promised winter was not far off. As they left Hill City behind, following a well-worn trail through rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines, Margot felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. 5 years, Callum replied, his hands steady on the reins. "I worked as a ranch hand for 10 years before that, saving every penny I could. When a parcel of land came up for sale, I bought it and started building. It has been slow going at times, but the ranch is finally starting to turn a real profit." "You built it yourself?" Margot asked, impressed despite herself. "With help," he admitted. "I hired some men for the heavy construction, but I did a lot of the work myself. When you grow up with nothing, you learn to do things with your own hands." "Where did you grow up?" she asked, genuinely curious now. "Kansas," he said. "My parents were farmers, but they died when I was 16. Drought took the crops and fever took them. I headed west because there was nothing left for me there." "I am sorry," Margot said softly. "My parents died too. Fever about a year ago." Callum glanced at her and she saw understanding in his eyes. "It is hard losing them. Makes you feel unmoored, like you are drifting without an anchor." "That is exactly how it feels," she said, surprised that he had put it into words so precisely. They talked more easily after that, sharing bits of their histories. Callum told her about his early days in South Dakota, learning the cattle business and saving money. Margot told him about growing up in Illinois, helping her mother with sewing and her father in his small shop. It was the most personal conversation she had had with anyone in months, and she found herself relaxing in his presence. When they crested a hill and Callum pointed ahead, saying, "There it is," Margot leaned forward to see. The ranch spread out in a valley below them, sheltered by hills on 3 sides. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built of logs and painted white, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Several outbuildings dotted the property. A large barn, a stable, what looked like a bunkhouse, and a small cottage set apart from the others, surrounded by a white picket fence. "That would be your cottage," Callum said, nodding toward it. The previous housekeeper lived there and loved it. It has a bedroom, a sitting room, and a small kitchen, though you would take most of your meals in the main house while preparing mine. As they drew closer, Margot could see that everything was well maintained. The fences were in good repair, the buildings looked solid, and even the grounds were neat. Several men were working in the distance, tending to cattle in a large corral. Callum pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and helped her down. "Let me show you around." The inside of the house was spacious and well built, if somewhat Spartan in decoration. The main floor had a large kitchen with a modern stove, a dining room with a sturdy table that could seat 8, and a comfortable sitting room with a fireplace. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, though Callum explained he only used one. The previous owner had a family, he said. "I bought the place from his widow after he passed. She wanted to move back east to her people." The cottage was even more charming than the main house. It was small but perfectly formed, with cheerful curtains on the windows and a little iron stove that would keep it warm in winter. The bedroom had space for a real bed, not a narrow cot, and the sitting room had a comfortable chair positioned near a window that looked out over the valley. "It is beautiful," Margot said honestly, running her hand over the smooth wooden table in the cottage kitchen. "It is more than I ever hoped for." "So you will take the position?" Callum asked, and she heard hope in his voice. She turned to face him, this man who was offering her a chance at something better. She had learned to be cautious to protect herself, but sometimes you had to take a leap of faith. "Yes," she said, "I will take it. I will give Mrs. Henderson my notice today." The smile that spread across Callum's face made her own heart lift. "That is wonderful news. You will not regret this, Miss Lawson. I promise you that." As they drove back to Hill City, Margot felt lighter than she had in months. She was taking a risk, yes, but it felt like the right kind of risk. And something about Callum made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her parents died. Giving notice to Mrs. Henderson went about as well as expected. The older woman was furious at losing a reliable worker and tried to guilt Margot into staying, but Margot held firm. She had given proper notice, and she had a better opportunity waiting. Mrs. Henderson finally accepted it with poor grace, making the next 2 weeks as difficult as possible. But Margot endured it because she knew it was temporary. Clara was happy for her, though clearly envious, and even helped her pack her few belongings into the small trunk that held everything she owned. "Promise you will come visit," Clara insisted on Margot's last day. "I want to hear all about ranch life." "I promise," Margot said, hugging the younger girl. "Take care of yourself, Clara, and if an opportunity comes your way, do not be afraid to take it." Callum arrived with the wagon early on a Sunday morning when Margot's employment officially ended. She had said her goodbyes the night before, and there was nothing keeping her in Hill City anymore. As she climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him, trunk loaded in the back, she felt like she was starting a new chapter of her life. The ranch looked different this time, knowing it would be her home. Callum helped her move her belongings into the cottage, then gave her the rest of the day to settle in. "Take your time getting comfortable," he said from the cottage doorway. "We can start your official duties tomorrow. If you need anything, just let me know." After he left, Margot stood in the middle of her new sitting room and turned slowly in a circle, taking it all in. She had her own space, her own home, for the first time in her adult life. The realization brought tears to her eyes, and she sank down onto the chair by the window and let herself cry, releasing months of pent-up stress and worry. When the tears finally stopped, she felt cleansed somehow. She washed her face at the kitchen pump, then began unpacking her trunk and making the cottage truly hers. It did not take long since she owned so little, but by the time darkness fell, the cottage felt like home. The next morning, she woke with the sun and made her way to the main house. Callum had left a key for her under the mat, and she let herself into the kitchen. It was clear he had been trying to keep house himself and doing a poor job of it. Dishes were stacked in the sink, the floor needed sweeping, and the stove needed a good cleaning. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time Callum came in for breakfast, the kitchen was spotless and she had fresh coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in a pan. "Good morning," he said, looking around in surprise. "You have been busy." "That is what you are paying me for," Margot replied, cracking eggs into the pan. "How do you like your eggs, however they come?" he said with a grin, settling at the table. "I am not picky." They fell into an easy routine over the next few weeks. Margot woke early, prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, did laundry, and prepared dinner. In between, Callum showed her the ranch books and explained his accounting system, which was fairly simple but had gotten behind during the months without a housekeeper. She discovered she had a knack for numbers, and she enjoyed bringing order to the ledgers. Callum was a good businessman but hated paperwork, so having someone else handle it was a relief to him. More than that, they enjoyed each other's company. Callum was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that made her laugh. He treated her with respect, never ordering her around but asking politely if she could do things. And he was genuinely interested in her opinions, especially when it came to ranch business. "What do you think about adding more horses?" he asked one evening in November as she was clearing away the dinner dishes. "There is good money in breeding horses, but it takes more initial investment than cattle." "What does your gut tell you?" Margot asked, pausing with a plate in her hands. "That it is a good idea," he admitted, "but I wanted a second opinion." "Then do it," she said simply. "You have good instincts, Callum, trust them." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. Callum's eyes lit up, and Margot felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, Margot," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice sent a little thrill through her. As the weeks turned into months, Margot realized she was happier than she had been in years. She loved the ranch, loved the work, and if she was honest with herself, she was developing feelings for Callum that went beyond simple employment. She tried to tell herself it was foolish. He was her employer, and she was his housekeeper. There was a natural boundary there that should not be crossed. But Callum made it hard to maintain that boundary. He sought out her company in the evenings, sitting by the fire and talking with her about everything from politics to philosophy. He asked her advice on ranch decisions and actually listened to what she said. He made her feel valued in a way no one ever had before. One December evening, when a snowstorm raged outside and the fire crackled warmly in the sitting room, Callum finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. "Margot," he said, setting down the book he had been pretending to read, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from the shirt she was mending for him, her heart suddenly beating faster. "What is it?" "I did not bring you out here just to be my housekeeper," he said, his voice serious. "I mean, I did need a housekeeper, that was true. But from the moment I saw you scrubbing that floor in the hotel, I saw something in you. A strength, a dignity, a worth that had nothing to do with the work you were doing. You deserved better than that place, better than being treated as invisible." Margot set down her sewing with trembling hands. "Callum, what are you saying?" He stood and crossed to where she sat, dropping to one knee beside her chair. "I am saying that I brought you here because I wanted to give you the life you deserve. I wanted to show you that you are worth so much more than scrubbing floors for people who do not appreciate you. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Her breath caught in her throat. "You love me." "I love you," he confirmed, taking her hand in his. "I love your laugh, your intelligence, the way you hum when you are working on the books." I love how you stand up to me when you think I am being stubborn. I love coming home to find you here. You are not just my housekeeper, Margot. You are my partner, my equal, and I want you to be my wife." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to be sensible, but I cannot help it. I love you, Callum." He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Then say you will marry me. Say you will be my wife, my true partner in everything." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." Callum pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and it felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you," he said softly, "I will spend every day of my life showing you how valued you are. You will never be less than my equal, never treated as anything but the remarkable woman you are." "I know," Margot said, because she did. She had seen it in every action, every word, every moment since they met. Callum did not just say she was his equal. He treated her that way, and that made all the difference. They were married in Hill City on a bright January morning, with Clara standing up as Margot's witness and Callum's foreman, Tom, serving as his. It was a simple ceremony, but to Margot it was perfect. She wore a new dress that Callum had insisted on buying her, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and he wore his best suit. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Callum kissed her in front of the small gathering of friends and ranch hands who had come to witness the ceremony, Margot felt like the luckiest woman in South Dakota. The ranch became truly theirs that winter. Margot moved her things from the cottage into the main house, into Callum's bedroom, and they began building a life together. It was not always easy. The winter was harsh, and they lost some cattle to the cold. Money was tight at times, and they both worked long hours to keep the ranch running smoothly. But they worked side by side, as true partners. Callum valued Margot's input on every decision, from which cattle to sell to how to negotiate with buyers. She proved to have a sharp business mind, and under her management of the books, they actually started showing a better profit than before. More than that, they were happy. Margot had never known that marriage could be like this, full of laughter and conversation and genuine companionship. Callum was not just her husband but her best friend, and she fell more in love with him every day. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, and talk about their dreams for the future. Callum wanted to expand the ranch, bring in those horses he had talked about. Margot wanted to start a small garden in the spring, maybe even get some chickens. "And children?" Callum asked one night, his hand resting gently on her stomach. "Do you want children, Margot?" "I do," she said softly. "Do you?" "More than anything," he said, kissing her temple. "I want a house full of children, running around and causing happy chaos. I want to build something lasting, something we can pass on to the next generation." Spring came, bringing new life to the ranch. Margot planted her garden with seeds they bought in Hill City, and Callum brought home a dozen chickens that made her laugh with their silly antics. The cattle fattened on spring grass, and the ranch hands worked from dawn to dusk, preparing for the busy summer season. And in late spring, Margot realized she was pregnant. She waited to tell Callum until she was sure, until the morning sickness had confirmed what her missed monthly courses suggested. She chose a warm evening in May when the sunset painted the sky pink and gold, and they were sitting on the porch together watching the day end. "Callum," she said, taking his hand, "I have some news." He turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "What is it?" "You look like you are about to burst." "I am with child," she said simply. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then a grin spread across his face so wide it made her laugh. He swept her up in his arms, careful despite his excitement, and spun her around. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Margot, we are going to be parents." "We are," she confirmed, tears of joy streaming down her face. That night, lying in bed with Callum's hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, Margot thought about how far she had come. A year ago, she had been scrubbing floors in a hotel, invisible and forgotten. Now she was a wife, soon to be a mother, co-owner of a thriving ranch, and treated as an equal by a man who truly loved her. The pregnancy was not easy. Margot suffered terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and Callum fretted over her constantly. He insisted on hiring another woman from town to help with the heavy housework, a kind widow named Sarah who became a good friend to Margot. As her belly grew, Callum became even more protective. He would not let her lift anything heavy, and he often came in from the range in the middle of the day just to check on her. It might have been annoying if it had not been so clearly motivated by love. "I am not made of glass," Margot told him one afternoon in September, when he had rushed in after she had felt a particularly strong kick from the baby. "I know," Callum said, his hand spread wide over her belly, feeling the movement beneath. "But you are carrying the most precious thing in the world to me. Both of you are." Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at leaving his warm home. Margot labored for hours, with Sarah and the doctor from Hill City attending her, while Callum paced in the sitting room below, nearly wearing a path in the floor. When Sarah finally called him up to meet his son, Callum took the stairs 3 at a time. Margot was exhausted but glowing, propped up against pillows with a tiny bundle in her arms. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse but happy. Callum approached like he was in a dream, staring down at the red-faced infant who had already captured his heart. "He is perfect," he breathed. "Margot, he is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" she asked, shifting the baby so Callum could hold him. "I was thinking about my father," Callum said hesitantly, carefully taking the precious bundle. "His name was Thomas, and your father was William, was he not?" "Thomas William Xander," Margot said, trying it out. "I like it. It honors both of them." Little Thomas, or Tommy as they quickly began calling him, brought even more joy to the ranch. Callum proved to be a devoted father, changing nappies without complaint and walking the floor with the baby in the middle of the night so Margot could rest. He built a beautiful cradle for the nursery, carving animals along the sides with his own hands. As Tommy grew from an infant into a chubby, curious baby, the ranch continued to prosper. Callum had finally purchased those horses he wanted, and they proved to be a good investment. Margot managed the books and helped make decisions about which animals to breed and when to sell. They were true partners in every sense of the word, and their love only deepened with time. When Tommy was 2 years old, Margot discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she was less nervous about the process, though Callum fretted just as much as before. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Margot's mother, arrived in the spring with much less drama than her brother. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Margot and Callum built the life they had dreamed of together. They added more rooms to the house as the family expanded, and hired more ranch hands to help with the growing operation. Clara came to visit often, eventually meeting and marrying one of the ranch hands, a nice young man named Patrick who treated her well. She and Margot remained close friends, and their children grew up playing together. Years passed, measured in spring calvings and fall roundups, in children's birthdays and holiday celebrations. Tommy grew tall and strong like his father, taking to ranch life naturally. Little Margaret proved to have her mother's head for numbers and often helped Margaret with the books. Two more children followed: Samuel, born when Tommy was 5, and Rose, arriving 3 years after that. The house was indeed full of happy chaos, just as Callum had wanted, and Margaret loved every minute of it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Callum surprised Margaret with a gift. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the children play in the yard, when he handed her a small box. "What is this?" she asked, curious. "Open it and see," he said with a smile. Inside was a beautiful brooch made of gold, shaped like a rose with tiny diamonds forming the dewdrops on its petals. It was the most beautiful thing Margaret had ever owned. "Callum, it is too much," she protested, even as her eyes filled with tears. "It is not nearly enough," he said, taking her hand. "Margaret, you transformed my life. You took a lonely ranch and made it a home. You are the best partner I could have ever hoped for in business and in life. You are my equal in every way, and I wanted you to have something that reflects your worth." "My worth is not measured in jewels," Margaret said, though she clutched the brooch to her heart. "It is measured in this, in our life together, in our children and our love." "I know," Callum said, pulling her close. "But I wanted to give you something beautiful anyway, something that lasts like our love." That night, after the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch as they had done countless times before. Margaret wore her new brooch pinned to her dress, and Callum's arm was around her shoulders. "You ever think about that day I first saw you?" Callum asked. "Scrubbing floors at that hotel?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "I knew the moment I saw you," Callum said. "I knew you were special, that you deserved so much more than what you had. I am just grateful you took a chance on me." "You saw my worth when no one else did," Margaret said, turning to look at him. "You treated me as an equal from the very beginning. You gave me not just a job but a partnership, a life. I am the one who is grateful." "We gave each other a life," Callum corrected, kissing her softly. "We built this together as equals. That is how it should be." As the years continued to roll by, the ranch grew into one of the most successful in the Black Hills. Margaret and Callum's partnership remained the foundation of that success. She handled the business side with skill, negotiating deals and managing finances, while Callum oversaw the daily operations and the breeding program that had become their specialty. Their children grew into capable young adults. Tommy, at 18, was already taking on more responsibility at the ranch, proving to have his father's way with horses. Margaret, at 16, had the makings of a fine businesswoman and often helped her mother with complex negotiations. Samuel showed an interest in medicine and talked about becoming a veterinarian, while little Rose, still only 10 years old, showed talent with a sketch pad and spent hours drawing the animals. One evening in the fall of 1892, 14 years after they first met, Margaret and Callum stood on their porch watching the sunset. The house behind them rang with the sounds of family, the children laughing over dinner, and Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. "Do you remember what you promised me?" she asked Callum, leaning against his solid presence. "I promised you many things," he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "Which promise are you thinking of?" "You promised to spend every day showing me I was valued," she said. "That I would never be less than your equal." "And have I kept that promise?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer. "Every single day," Margaret confirmed, turning to face him. "You have shown me what it means to be truly partnered with someone, to be respected and valued and loved. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "We gave each other that life," Callum said, as he always did. "I was just a lonely rancher before you came along. You made this house a home. You made me complete. "We complete each other," Margot said, standing on her toes to kiss him. After 14 years of marriage, his kiss still made her heart flutter. As they stood there watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Margot thought about the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment. If someone had told her, when she was scrubbing floors at the Grand Northern Hotel, that she would end up here, as a respected rancher's wife and equal partner, she never would have believed it. But Callum had seen something in her that day, something even she had not fully recognized. He had seen her worth, her potential, her strength, and he had given her the opportunity to become the woman she was meant to be. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the Xander Ranch prospered through good years and bad. Margot and Callum faced challenges together: droughts that tested their reserves, harsh winters that required careful management, market fluctuations that demanded strategic thinking. But they always faced these challenges as partners, valuing each other's input equally. When Tommy turned 21, he married a sweet girl from Hill City named Lucy, and they built a house on the far corner of the ranch property. A year later, they made Margot and Callum grandparents with the birth of a robust baby boy they named Callum Jr. Margaret surprised everyone by deciding to go to Teachers College in Rapid City. Margot supported her daughter's ambitions wholeheartedly, understanding the importance of a woman having her own path. Callum was initially hesitant, but came around when Margot reminded him that their daughter had the same right to pursue her dreams as their sons did. Samuel did indeed become a veterinarian, studying in Omaha before returning to the Black Hills to set up a practice that served ranchers throughout the region. He often worked with his father's horses, and the two of them together advanced the quality of the ranch's breeding program significantly. Rose, the youngest, developed into a talented artist whose paintings of ranch life and western landscapes began to sell to tourists and collectors. She set up a small studio in Hill City, but remained close to the family, often coming home for Sunday dinners that Margot still insisted on hosting. As Margot and Callum moved into their 40s and then 50s, their partnership only strengthened. The physical passion of their early years mellowed into a deep, abiding love that needed no words. They could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, could anticipate each other's needs and thoughts with the ease of long practice. On quiet evenings, they would sit together and reminisce about their journey. Callum never tired of telling the story of how he first saw Margot at the hotel, how something in him had recognized that she was special. Margot would remind him how nervous she had been on that first wagon ride to the ranch, how she had hardly dared to hope that the opportunity was real. "You took a chance on me," Callum would say. "You saw my worth," Margot would reply, and always they would agree. "We built this together." The year 1900 arrived with celebration throughout Hill City and the surrounding ranches. The turn of the century felt momentous, a threshold into a new era. Margot was 45 years old now, with silver threading through her dark hair, and Callum was 50, his temples gray but his eyes still that striking blue-gray that had caught her attention all those years ago. They stood on their porch on New Year's Day, watching their family gather in the yard. Tommy and Lucy were there with their 3 children now. Margaret had arrived from Rapid City with a young professor she was courting, a kind man named James who looked at her with adoration. Samuel had brought his new wife, Helen, a doctor's daughter who shared his passion for animal welfare, and Rose flitted among them all, sketchbook in hand, capturing the family moments. 22 years, Margot said softly, more to herself than to Callum. 22 years since I left that hotel. 22 years since I found my partner, Callum replied, pulling her close. The best 22 years of my life. Mine too, Margot agreed. She looked out at the ranch, at the prosperity they had built together, at the family they had created. Everything she saw bore the mark of their partnership, their mutual respect, their love. That spring brought another significant change. Margaret married James in a beautiful ceremony on the ranch, with the whole community in attendance. Margaret watched her daughter exchange vows with a man who clearly saw her as an equal partner, and she felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She and Callum had modeled a marriage of mutual respect, and their children were carrying that lesson forward into their own relationships. As the years advanced into the new century, Margaret and Callum gradually began stepping back from the day-to-day management of the ranch. Tommy took over most of the operations, proving himself to be as capable as his father. But Margaret and Callum remained involved, their experience and wisdom valued by their son and the ranch hands who had worked with them for decades. They spent more time together, taking long rides across the property they had built together, visiting their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. The love between them, tested by time and trials, had only grown stronger. One evening in the summer of 1906, when Margaret was 51 and Callum was 56, they sat on their porch as the sun set, as they had done thousands of times before. But this time, Margaret had something specific she wanted to say. "Callum," she began, taking his weathered hand in hers, "I want you to know something." "What is it, my love?" he asked, turning his full attention to her as he always did. "When I was scrubbing that floor at the hotel, I thought my life was over," she said. "I thought I had been reduced to nothing, that I would never be more than invisible help in a building full of people who did not see me. But you saw me." "I could not help but see you," Callum said. "You shone even in that dim lobby." "You saw my worth when I had almost forgotten it myself," Margaret continued. "And you did more than just see it. You gave me the opportunity to realize it, to become the person I was meant to be. You treated me as your equal from the very beginning, and that made all the difference." "You were always my equal," Callum said simply. "I just gave you the space to show it." "We saved each other," Margaret said. "You gave me a life and I gave you a home. Together we built something beautiful." "The most beautiful thing," Callum agreed. "A partnership based on love and respect." "That is what I wanted from the moment I first spoke to you. And that is what we have had every day since." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple as the sun disappeared below the horizon. In the distance, they could hear Tommy calling to the ranch hands, the lowing of cattle settling for the night, the everyday sounds of the life they had built together. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "For what?" Callum asked. "For seeing me," she replied. "For loving me. For making me your equal in all things. For giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you," Callum echoed, "for saying yes. For taking a chance. For being the partner I needed, for loving me, for building this life with me." He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. This was home, she thought. Not the ranch, not the house, but this, being in the arms of the man who had seen her worth and helped her realize her full potential. The years continued to pass with grace. More grandchildren arrived, and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch remained prosperous under Tommy's management, with the foundation that Margaret and Callum had built keeping it strong through changing times. Margaret and Callum grew old together, their steps slower but their love unwavering. They still sat on the porch together most evenings, still held hands like young lovers, still looked at each other with eyes full of affection and respect. When they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, the whole county seemed to turn out for the celebration. Their children and grandchildren, organized a party at the ranch that lasted from afternoon into evening, with music and dancing and more food than could be eaten. But Margot's favorite moment came late in the evening when she and Callum slipped away from the crowd to stand together on their porch, looking out over the land they had built together. 50 years, Margot said, marveling at it. Half a century together. The best 50 years possible, Callum said. He was 78 now, his hair white and his back slightly bent, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence and warmth that had drawn her from the beginning. "You have any regrets?" Margot asked, at 73 still beautiful in his eyes. "Not a single one," Callum said firmly. "From the moment I saw you scrubbing that floor, I knew my life was about to change, and it did in every way that mattered. You were the making of me, Margot. We were the making of each other," she corrected gently, as she always did. "Partners, equals, always." "Always," he agreed, kissing her softly. They lived several more good years together, surrounded by family and the fruits of their labor. The ranch continued to thrive. Their children were happy and successful. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the values they had instilled. Callum passed peacefully in his sleep in 1931, at the age of 81, with Margot holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but found comfort in their children and in the knowledge that they had lived a full, beautiful life together. Margot herself lived another 5 years, remaining sharp and engaged despite her advanced age. She spent her final years documenting the history of the ranch for future generations, wanting them to know the story of how it all began, how a man had seen worth in a woman scrubbing floors and had offered her not just a job, but a partnership that transformed both their lives. She passed away in her sleep in 1936, at the age of 81, the same age Callum had been. Her family laid her to rest beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky as big and blue as the one that had greeted her on her first ride out from Hill City all those decades ago. On their shared headstone, their children had inscribed, "Partners in all things, equals in love, together forever." And so the story of Margot and Callum Xander became legend in the Black Hills, passed down through generations. The story of a woman who had been reduced to scrubbing floors and a man who had seen her true worth. The story of a partnership built on mutual respect and love. The story of two people who had built something lasting and beautiful together as equals, just as it should be. The ranch they founded continued to prosper for generations, always managed with the values they had instilled. Hard work, integrity, and the belief that every person has worth and deserves to be treated with respect. Their descendants carried forward the lesson that true partnership requires seeing and valuing the worth in another person, regardless of their circumstances. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the wind swept across the hills and the sunset painted the sky gold and pink, people swore they could still see two figures standing on the porch of the old ranch house, hand in hand, watching over the land they had loved and the family they had created together. Their bond unbroken even by death, their love eternal as the rolling prairie itself.